Welcome to The Debate, continuing our series on financial battlegrounds. Today, we're diving into Operation Chargeback, which is this massive German investigation. It unveiled a really stunning 300 million euro fraud scheme.
Yeah, involving the data of, 4.3 million cardholders. And allegedly fueled by collusion within major German payment service providers, the PSPs.
Exactly. The sheer scale, crossing 193 countries apparently. It's a real watershed moment for analyzing financial crime, I think. So our central question today is this. Does Operation Chargeback primarily showcase the success of aggressive, centralized regulatory force, BaFin's muscular new doctrine post-Wirecard, and maybe the emerging EU AMLA blueprint in correcting systemic financial crime?
Or does the sheer longevity of it and the internal nature of the crime, does that actually confirm that the core challenge remains this intractable, resilient vulnerability, vulnerability to advanced internal corruption and these sophisticated crime-as-a-service CAS models?
Right. So I'll be arguing that this operation really validates the aggressive regulatory action as the necessary blueprint for future global compliance.
And I come at it from a different angle. While, look, the arrests are obviously welcomed, I believe the core lesson here is the profound and frankly resilient systemic vulnerability that's confirmed by the fraud sophistication, its internal rot, and, the staggering financial damage that just remains unrecovered.
Okay, well, I see Operation Chargeback as a clear success story for regulatory evolution. I'd argue this is really a validation of Germany's new muscular post-Wirecard doctrine. We are no longer dealing with the maybe hesitant regulators of 2020. And this shift in resolve, I think it's best supported by the timeline of intervention. We know the fraud ran for years, yes, but BaFin successfully halted the criminal operations through using aggressive tools like business restrictions and prohibitions way back in 2021. That's 4 years before the major public action day of arrests in 2025. They quietly purged the PSPs of these actors, essentially, and stopped the financial loss immediately. That's a demonstration of effectiveness, surely not passivity.
Okay.
Furthermore, this operation provides the essential Exhibit A for accelerating global regulatory reform, specifically supporting the creation of the Central EU Anti-Money Laundering Authority, AMLA. When a scheme relies on cross-border manipulation through multiple jurisdictions, Cyprus, the UK, you name it, only a central, empowered authority like AMLA can really hope to enforce the necessary consistency and, follow the money globally. The system learned and it corrected itself decisively.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that celebratory narrative of decisive success. If we're judging success based on correcting the system, then we have to focus on the rot the operation exposed. Because, it reveals these intractable vulnerabilities that systemic reforms really struggle to neutralize.
Okay, but how so?
Look at the evidence of internal compromise. The arrest of 6 individuals described as executives and, crucially, compliance officers, at the German PSPs. These are the gatekeepers, the people meant to stop this stuff. They were allegedly paid fees to collude with the fraud networks. Now, when the anti-financial crime function itself is compromised from the inside, no amount of external regulatory oversight can save the system. The checks were being defeated by the checkers themselves. And the enduring consequence of this failure is the damage permanence. 300 million euros stolen, but only just over 35 million euros in assets seized. That 90% chasm is what I call the great restitution gap. It proves that for the 4.3 million victims, the outcome is devastating and, permanent, regardless of when BaFin technically acted. The fact that compliance officers were allegedly paid to defeat the chargeback mechanism, the very consumer protection safeguard, that shows the rot was so profound it rendered standard regulatory checks, frankly, useless.
That is the core tension here, I agree. The efficacy of regulatory force against the resilience of criminal infrastructure. Your point on internal corruption is powerful, absolutely. But I'd argue that rot exists because the old human-dependent compliance model was just too easily compromised.
But if we are talking about resilience, let's look at the operational sophistication of the fraud. You celebrate the arrests of the 18 individuals running the fraudulent merchant accounts, the so-called clients, right? But the material clearly states these networks didn't build their infrastructure, they outsourced it. They essentially bought anonymity and operational capability wholesale from specialized crime-as-a-service providers.
I agree that the rise of CAS is, one of the most sophisticated challenges facing financial crime prevention today, no doubt.
The structural problem for regulation, though, is that arresting the 18 users doesn't dismantle the industrial CAS entity that supplied the infrastructure. This CAS provider, it furnished complete corporate structures, including fake directors, pristine know-your-customer documents, enabling the criminals to operate over 500 shell companies across multiple jurisdictions. That specialized entity, still out there, operational, selling institutional-grade anonymity to the next 100 criminal networks globally. And this resilience is further amplified by the alleged involvement of Jan Marsalek, the fugitive Wirecard executive. This isn't just common fraud, it's looking like a sophisticated, systemic Wirecard 2.0. We're seeing an expert ecosystem of established financial criminals capable of penetrating and leveraging legitimate PSPs at the highest levels. State-level intervention, it feels like it's playing a game of whack-a-mole against a criminal supply chain that's outsourced its infrastructure for maximum stability.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. That's a compelling delineation of the threat landscape, and the resilience you describe is sobering. I would argue, however, that the very complexity of CAS and the fact that it requires managing 500 shell companies, that itself is the definitive public justification for the regulator's next necessary evolution, the technological mandate. The material confirms the compliance model is brittle, yes, and that is precisely why the solution must be technological.
Technological solutions are fine, but what specifically are you proposing that can defeat a human gatekeeper who is paid to lie about KYC documents and, manipulate transaction data?
The focus has to shift entirely to network analysis, specifically Graph AI. You see, the weakness of the CAA model is its need for scale and efficiency. They create hundreds of seemingly independent merchant accounts, all with clean-looking forged paperwork. A traditional rules-based system or a human compliance officer, they check the name and address for each one individually. It's basically box ticking.
Right.
Graph AI doesn't just check the boxes. It maps the hidden relationships between the vast amounts of metadata. It can spot in milliseconds that those 500 accounts, though having different directors, are all being accessed by the same single compromised device ID, for instance, or that they all share the same obscure IP address footprint used by the CAA provider. Or maybe they filed their paperwork using the exact same typeface or unique scanner artifact that traces back to a single source. You see?
Okay.
The technology forces compliance into a verification mindset, not just a documentation mindset. Graph AI is capable of spotting the non-obvious links that human eyes and especially compromised compliance officers are designed to ignore. Operation Chargeback provides the necessary Exhibit A for mandatory investment in this kind of advanced technology across the PSP sector. The regulator can now credibly demand a shift from passive compliance reporting to proactive, real-time network detection. That makes internal collusion instantly more visible, potentially.
I understand the necessity of better tools, I do. But you are arguing that technology will force internal corruption to become technologically literate, which just raises the arms race stakes further, doesn't it? And moreover, let's just revisit the regulatory timeline for a second. You emphasized BaFin stopping the activities in 2021. Okay. But if the threat was successfully stopped then, why did the coordinated international arrests, the moment of actual accountability for the individuals, only happen 4 subsequent years later in 2025? If centralized, aggressive regulation is the success story, why the profound 4-year delay in bringing the perpetrators to justice? That delay, to me, demonstrates the glacial pace and complexity of centralized bureaucracy, even when it is proactive, and it highlights the difference between stopping the bleeding and actually delivering justice.
Well, I agree the delay is significant, yes, but the operational delay is likely a reflection of the judicial complexity of prosecuting global financial crime involving networks across, 193 countries. It's not necessarily a failing of the regulatory intervention itself. BaFin's primary mandate was immediate consumer protection and market integrity, stopping the flow of fraudulent funds, which, as I said, they achieved in 2021 via those business restrictions. The subsequent 4 years were probably necessary to build the complex, admissible legal case required to dismantle the entire CAS network infrastructure. That needs deep cooperation between European investigators, Europol, dozens of international judicial bodies. It takes time. The crucial point remains: the operational loss stopped when BaFin acted decisively, demonstrating their new power.
Okay, let's dissect the second point of systemic failure then. The nature of the low and slow method itself. Because it relies on exploitation.
Indeed, the genius, if you can call it that, of the fraud was this brilliant psychological exploit, the recurring €50 charge. It was carefully calibrated, high enough to net the $300 million in aggregate, but low enough that it blended perfectly with what we all suffer from, subscription fatigue, right? It stayed beneath the standard high scrutiny alert thresholds that were typically set for high-value transfers.
It exploits the consumer's apathy, basically, regarding small recurring debits on their statements, treating the loss as an administrative oversight until the damage becomes monumental.
Exactly. But BaFin's response to this was comprehensive, appointing a special AML monitor to pay one, freezing Unser's ability to onboard new merchants. These actions targeted the source of the systemic failure. This represents BaFin moving toward a strict liability model, holding PSPs accountable for the high-risk merchants they onboard, particularly those in high-risk categories like dating and pornography, where these schemes seem to flourish. The regulator learned the exploit and acted decisively to close that systemic loophole through force.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered— I agree that targeting high-risk sectors is necessary, of course, but I would argue that the systemic failure wasn't primarily a technical oversight of a threshold setting. It was, as the investigation implies, active, internal betrayal by the gatekeepers. The system failed for 5 full years, racking up $300 million in loss because the gatekeepers were allegedly paid to ensure the fraudulent transactions looked legitimate.
I would agree that the human element is always the weakest link, which necessitates technological enforcement, as I argued.
And that is the critical difference between our positions, I think. The chargeback mechanism. It's the fundamental consumer protection safeguard. It allows victims to reclaim funds from fraudulent merchants. But in this case, insiders allegedly neutralized that entire function. They ensured the fraudulent transactions appeared legitimate enough to defeat the chargeback requests initiated by banks and cardholders. So the 4.3 million victims were essentially trapped. Their only recourse was neutralized by the very compliance function meant to uphold it. This isn't just a matter of adjusting a technology threshold, it's a profound, cynical corruption of trust.
But the imposition of strict liability is precisely designed to make that internal corruption unsustainable. If the PSP faces existential business restrictions like freezing the ability to onboard new clients because a single compliance officer has been compromised, the incentive structure fundamentally changes. The corporate liability for failure becomes so massive that the system must invest in graph AI and robust verification technologies precisely to reduce reliance on subjective human judgment, thereby fencing off the opportunities for insider collaboration. The cost of internal rot becomes too high to bear.
That's a compelling argument regarding BaFin's strict liability model, I grant you that. But if the compliance officer is paid enough to subvert the system, they will simply target the next, more advanced vulnerability, won't they? They'll be the first ones to figure out how to feed poisoned or obfuscating data to your graph AI model. The ghost of Marsalek and the persistence of the CAS model confirm that this is a professional, adaptable, resilient criminal infrastructure. It simply absorbs the cost of increased regulatory enforcement and shifts tactics. A new regulation is, ultimately, only as effective as the integrity of the people deploying it.
Okay, to summarize my position, the exposure of that internal corruption is precisely why this operation represents a turning point. Operation Chargeback validated BaFin's new aggressive posture, imposing existential restrictions and mandating shifts to advanced verification-based technologies like graph AI. This has fundamentally altered the compliance structure, making sustained internal corruption far harder and more costly to achieve, and ensuring the PSPs carry the liability for their merchants. It's a step forward.
And while that regulatory evolution is certainly necessary and welcome, The operation's true and, I think, sobering lesson lies in the resilience and adaptability of professional, collusive financial crime, exemplified by the Sachs model, and the pervasive reach of internal rot. The $300 million restitution gap confirms that the human and financial cost of this systemic vulnerability remains the defining challenge, requiring constant, vigilant challenge to the very foundation of system integrity.
So we are left with this undeniable reality, aren't we? That the operational success of dismantling the network is, well, juxtaposed against the profound fragility of the financial infrastructure it managed to exploit for so long.
Indeed. The material confirms that the ongoing battle between regulation and technology against adaptable financial crime, it remains an evolving and complex endeavor. And there is certainly much more to explore regarding this necessary balance in the financial battlegrounds ahead.